All rise, veuillez vous lever. The International Criminal Court is now in session. L'audience de la Cour pénale internationale est ouverte. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Good morning, Madam President. Good morning, Your Honors. This is the situation in Libya in the case of the prosecutor versus Khalid Mohammed Ali Hishri. Case reference ICC 0111-0125, and for the record, we are in open session.
Merci. Bonjour à tous. Je souhaite la bienvenue à tout le monde à l'intérieur et à l'extérieur de cette salle d'audience. Je vais maintenant demander aux parties et participants de se présenter, en commençant par vous, Madame la procureure adjointe.
Today, the Office of the Prosecutor is represented by myself, Nazat Shamim Khan, Deputy Prosecutor, and Nicole Sampson, Senior Trial Lawyer, Trial Lawyers Hisham Murad, Diane Looping, and Renz van der Werf, Jessica Lacey, Case Manager, and that is the team for the prosecution. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je me tourne maintenant vers le Conseil de la Défense. Vous avez la parole. Monsieur le Conseil de la Défense, la parole.
شكرا سيدة الرئيسة. فريق الدفاع للسيد خالد الهشري يتكون اليوم مني أنا ياسر حسن المحامي الرئيسي، والسيد إيان إدوارد، والسيدة إما، والسيد أحمد العمار، والسيد إسلام الحديدي، والسيدة مريم وهبي، والسيدة آية مراد. شكرا سيدة الرئيسة. عفوا سيدة الرئيس، ومعنا المتدربة خوليا الذي تحضر لأول مرة في المحكمة الجنائية الدولية.
Merci beaucoup, maître. J'invite les représentants légaux des victimes à se présenter.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Les victimes sont représentées par Paulina Massida, conseil principal, Tart von Litzenborg, Ahmad Issa, Anna Peña et moi-même, Sarah Pellet, conseil au bureau du Conseil public pour les victimes.
Merci beaucoup, maître Pellet. Quant à la Chambre, à ma droite, la juge reine Adélaïde Sophie Alapinigansou et à ma gauche, la juge Maria de Socorro Flores Liera. Je m'appelle Julia Antoinella Motok et je suis la présidente de la Chambre préliminaire 1. Nous entamons maintenant l'audience relative à la confirmation des charges portées par l'accusation à l'encontre de M. Al-Hishri. Conformément au calendrier contenu dans nos ordonnances du 28 avril dernier, document numéro 106, l'audience se déroula sur 3 jours. Nous attendons des observations orales du procureur, des représentants légaux des victimes, de même que celles de l'équipe de défense de M. Al-Hishri. À ce stade de la procédure, le rôle des juges est de déterminer s'il existe des éléments de preuve suffisantes pour considérer qu'il y a les motifs substantiels de croire que M. Al-Hishri a commis chacun des crimes qui sont reprochés. Si une et plusieurs charges sont confirmées, la Chambre préliminaire renverra, selon les procédures, l'affaire en procès. Les principes généraux qui s'appliquent à l'audience de cette semaine sont les suivants. D'abord, et c'est important, M. Al-Hishri est considéré comme innocent tant que sa culpabilité n'est pas prouvée devant la Cour. Ensuite, le fardeau de la preuve repose sur l'accusation qui doit fournir suffisamment d'éléments de preuve pour prouver que les charges qui lui sont reprochées ont un requis à l'article 61, paragraphe 7 du statut de Rome. Enfin, pour la défense, le suspect bénéficie des droits figurant aux articles 61 et 67 du statut du Rome. Je vais maintenant demander au greffier d'audience de procéder à la lecture des charges. Je rappelle que la version complète du document contenant les charges est accessible au public sur le site Internet de la Cour et que notre greffier d'audience fera la lecture d'une version abrégée de celui-ci. Je vous donne la parole, Monsieur le greffier.
The prosecution charges Mr. Khaled Mohammed Ali El-Hishri, also known as Khaled Al-Buti or Sheikh Khaled, with 17 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed between the 1st of May 2014 and 30th of June 2020 in Tripoli, Libya, against Mitiga prison detainees or persons otherwise in the custody or control of the perpetrators of the crimes at Mitiga prison, now described simply as the Mitiga perpetrators. Mr. El-Hishri was a senior member or associate of a group commonly known as the Special Deterrence Force, or RADA, led by Abdel Rauf Kara. This group came to assume significant power and influence in Tripoli, including by later receiving an official mandate as the deterrence apparatus for combating organized crime and terrorism, or DACOT. At all the times relevant to the charges, Kara and SDF Rada controlled a strategically important area of Tripoli known as the Mitiga compound, which included a prison facility, Mitiga prison, holding thousands of prisoners. The prison was under the de facto control of Kara and other senior SDF Rada members or associates. While some of these persons may also have held ranks or affiliations with Libyan state institutions, this did not change the de facto control exercised by Kara and those close to him. Under Kara's authority, Mr. El-Hishri was in a position to exercise general authority and influence throughout Mitiga prison from 2014 to 2020, and had direct control over the women's section and the persons detained therein. In that position, he personally committed numerous violent crimes, as well as participating in crimes committed by others. Specifically, Mr. El-Hishri is charged with the following crimes under the Rome Statute. Counts 1 to 6. Crimes related to the violent and arbitrary arrests, detention, and systematic mistreatment of civilians and or fighters hors de combat, including women and men, girls and boys, Libyans and non-Libyans, mainly at Mitiga prison, as follows. Count 1, imprisonment or other severe deprivation of physical liberty as a crime against humanity, concerning at least 945 detainees pursuant to Article 7(1)(e) of the Rome Statute. Count 2, outrages upon personal dignity as a war crime, concerning at least 945 detainees pursuant to Article 8(2)(c)(2). Count 3, cruel treatment as a war crime, concerning at least 945 detainees pursuant to Article 8(2)(c)(1) of the Rome Statute. Counts 4 to 5, torture as a crime against humanity and as a war crime concerning at least 945 detainees pursuant to Article 7(1)(f) and 8(2)(c)(1) of the Rome Statute. And count 6, other inhumane acts as a crime against humanity concerning at least 945 detainees pursuant to Article 7(1)(k). Counts 7 to 8. Rape concerning at least 10 detainees as a crime against humanity and as a war crime pursuant to Article 7(1)(g) and 8(2)(e)(6). Counts 9 to 10. Sexual violence concerning at least 49 detainees as a crime against humanity and as a war crime pursuant to Article 7(1)(g) and 8(2)(e)(6). The charged acts included forced nudity, counts 2 to 3, 6, and 9 to 10. Sexualized torture and invasive cavity searches, counts 2 to 10. Carried out in inappropriate and degrading conditions, and beyond what may be necessary for legitimate security reasons, including by or in front of other detainees, sometimes including relatives, members of the opposite sex, and children. Counts 11 to 12. Murder and attempted murder of at least 89 detainees as a war crime and crime against humanity pursuant to Article 7(1)(a) and 8(2)(c)(1) of the Rome Statute. The victims were either executed or otherwise killed immediately or died in the ordinary course of events resulting from acts of torture committed against them, or due to deliberate neglect and or the infliction of lethally inadequate conditions of detention. Count 13. Enslavement as a crime against humanity concerning at least 133 detainees pursuant to Article 7(1)(c) of the Rome Statute. These detainees, including Libyans, black migrants, mostly originating from East, West, Central, or Southern Africa, and other non-Libyans, were enslaved by Mitiga perpetrators who exercised ownership over them, severely deprived them of their liberty and their autonomy by controlling essentially every aspect of their lives. The enslaved detainees were deprived, for instance, of physical, psychological, sexual, and or reproductive autonomy exceeding normal constraints within a prison system, including control or restrictions over their movement and physical environment, and unlawfully imprisoned, control over their sexuality, sexual and reproductive autonomy, sexual and gender identity, subjection to torture, cruel treatment, and abuse or coercion, psychological control and pressure or coercion, including controls over their religious and other beliefs, and by threats and harm to family members, forced labor, and subjecting detainees to servile status. Counts 14 to 17. Persecution as a crime against humanity, pursuant to Article 7(1)(h), on various grounds, with targeting on an intersectional basis, concerning at least 138 detainees, namely, count 14, persecution on political grounds of at least 17 detainees, especially Libyans, perceived to oppose the Mitiga perpetrators or their associated groups, and black migrants, targeted according to the perpetrators' purported objective to suppress so-called illegal immigration or illegal migrant trafficking. Count 15. Persecution on religious grounds of at least 14 detainees who were perceived as non-compliant with the perpetrators' ideological views and practices, including because they were perceived to profess other beliefs and or not to conform with certain practices including with regard to prayer, dress, and or appearance, or otherwise by imposing Mitiga perpetrators' own ideological views and practices on their victims. Count 16, persecution on nationality, race, and or ethnicity, grounds of at least 47 detainees, primarily black migrants. And count 17, persecution on gender grounds of at least 60 detainees, comprising women and girls, actual and perceived LGBTQI+ persons, and men and boys subjected to sexual and or reproductive violence as a way to emasculate and subjugate them. The prosecution alleges that Mr. El-Hishri is individually criminally responsible for all of the above 17 counts, pursuant to Articles 25(3)(a), and additionally, and or alternatively, 25(3)(b), 25(3)(c), and 25(3)(d) of the statute, and seeks the confirmation of charges under all charged modes of liability. As such, Mr. El-Hishri is charged as follows. First, as a direct perpetrator, pursuant to Article 25(3)(a) of the Rome Statutes. During the charged period, Mr. El-Hishri directly perpetrated all the crimes charged in counts 1 to 17 against Mitiga prison detainees and persons otherwise in the custody or control of the Mitiga perpetrators. This includes allegations that he personally raped and committed acts of sexual violence against Libyan women, and that he personally tortured, murdered, illegally imprisoned, persecuted, enslaved, and committed acts of cruel treatment and other inhumane acts against the detained men, women, and children, principally at Mitiga prison, but also at other locations in and around Tripoli. Second, as a direct and or indirect co-perpetrator, pursuant to Article 25(3)(a) of the Rome Statute. During the charged period, Mr. El-Hishri worked with others, including Abdel Rauf Kara, Dawit Nzam, and Osama Njim, to jointly carry out the crimes charged in counts 1 to 17 against Mitiga prison detainees and persons otherwise in the custody or control of the Mitiga perpetrators, principally at Mitiga prison. The co-perpetrators shared a common plan or agreement to exercise control through means such as punishment, coercion, and other forms of exploitation of persons in the Mitiga perpetrators' custody or control, principally at Mitiga prison, in pursuit of Mitiga perpetrators' interests or views and or those of its members. Mr. El-Hishri made an essential contribution to the commission of the common plan crimes by exercising general authority and influence through Mitiga prison, B, directly controlling the women's section of Mitiga prison, and C, directly committing the charged crimes. Third, as an indirect perpetrator, pursuant to Article 25(3)(a) of the Rome Statutes. During the charged period, Mr. El-Hishri used Mitiga perpetrators with access to the women's section to ensure that the crimes charged in counts 1 to 17 would be committed against the women, girls, and young children detained therein. Fourth, additionally or alternatively, Mr. El-Hishri is charged with ordering and or inducing commission of the charged crimes pursuant to Article 25(3)(b) of the Rome Statutes, and or aiding and abetting or otherwise assisting the commission of the charged crimes pursuant to Article 25(3)(c) of the Rome Statute, and or contributing to the charged crimes committed by a group acting with a common purpose, pursuant to Article 25(3)d of the Rome Statute. Mr. El-Hishri committed the charged conduct with the required intent and knowledge for each mode of liability. Thank you, Your Honors.
Monsieur le greffier d'audience, un grand merci. Je note également la présence dans la salle d'audience du suspect, Monsieur Al-Hishri. Conformément au paragraphe 3 de la règle 122 du règlement de procédure et de preuve, et en avant d'en venir au fond, je dois demander aux parties si elles souhaitent faire des remarques orales s'agissant de la régularité des procédures qui ont précédé l'audience. Je rappelle que nous avons reçu et prendrons en considération, bien entendu, vos écritures, notamment les numéros 107 et 115. Donc, nul besoin de réitérer vos observations qui se trouvent déjà dans le dossier. Il va de même pour la contestation de la compétence de la Cour soulevée par la défense sur le fondement de l'article 19 du statut, écriture publique numéro 108. Conformément à notre ordonnance fixant le calendrier, la Chambre va recevoir des observations et des réponses à cette exception d'incompétence par écrit. Les questions attendant ne sont pas dans l'agenda d'audience des prochains jours. Je me tourne maintenant vers l'accusation. Avez-vous d'observations à formuler sur le fondement de l'article 123.3?
None from the prosecution, Madam President.
Merci beaucoup, Madame. Merci beaucoup, Madame la procureure adjointe. Je me tourne vers la défense. Maître, est-ce que vous avez des observations orales additionnelles ou complémentaires à formuler sur les fondements de la règle 102.3, paragraphe 3?
شكرا سيدة الرئيسة. نحن سنلتزم بالجدول المحدد.
Merci beaucoup. Nous pouvons désormais passer. Merci beaucoup. Nous pouvons désormais passer aux déclarations liminaires. Nous attendons le procureur et les représentants comme légaux communs des victimes ce matin et la défense à partir de 13h30 après le déjeuner. Je donne la parole à l'accusation pour environ 25 minutes. Vous avez la parole.
Madam President, honourable members of the bench, members of the Libyan and affected communities, and to those following these proceedings, today presents an important milestone in our collective pursuit of justice. The commencement of the confirmation of charges hearing against Mr. Khalid Mohammed Ali El-Hishri, known also as Khalid al-Bouti, is a testament to the tenacity of those most impacted by his crimes, to the courage and foresight of the international community in referring this situation to my office, and to the steadfast dedication of this court to investigate and prosecute those bearing responsibility for crimes committed in Libya, regardless of their power and influence. For 15 years, my office has had jurisdiction over the events in Libya and has diligently pursued its mandate as conferred on it by the United Nations Security Council. Despite a high number of active ICC warrants of arrest in the Libya situation, the arrest of Khalid el-Hishri and the commencement of these proceedings marks the first time that an individual will face justice before this court for crimes committed in Libya. This case conveys a clear message: no one is above the law, not even the most powerful. This confirmation of charges hearing is significant in bringing justice and accountability to thousands of his victims, including Libyan and non-Libyans, women and children. Khalid el-Hishri was able to act with impunity until his arrest in 2025. He and other leaders of the Special Deterrence Force, or SDF RADA, who controlled the Mitiga prison facilities, committed crimes without fear of punishment, consequences, or restrictions because of the security vacuum following the collapse of the Gaddafi regime and because of the ongoing non-international armed conflict through which they amassed significant power and formidable resources. My office assesses that there have been no genuine criminal prosecutions in Libya for these crimes, despite reports by the United Nations of alleged abuses at Mitiga prison, and despite direct reporting by victims to Libyan law enforcement and prosecutorial authorities. Madam President, Your Honors, there are substantial grounds to believe that Khalid el-Hishri is criminally responsible for the charged war crimes and crimes against humanity. He and other senior leaders of the SDF RADA controlled the Mitiga prison compound, where the complete disregard for the rights and dignity of detainees was institutionalized to create a climate of terror. Khalid el-Hishri was widely known as a notorious torturer at the helm of Mitiga prison, one of the largest detention centers in Western Libya. Witness P 1046 described him as amongst the worst instigators of violence at Mitiga prison. Witness P 1031 referred to him as the angel of death. One of his preferred torture methods, as described by witnesses, was to shoot people, especially in the leg and knee. He would also hang people with their hands bound behind their backs and beat people with a shovel. His authority at Mitiga prison is amply demonstrated through the evidence. Witness P 644 describes the authority that Khalid el-Hishri held and the fear he inspired, stating that when he was at Mitiga prison, I quote, "You could hear the flies. This means everyone was quiet and fearful and the guards respectful." End of quote. Witness P 692 confirmed that people in the prison were afraid of Khalid el-Hishri because he always wore his gun and he was ready to execute people. Your Honors, this case is about enforcing the most fundamental limits on power, that those who detain others must do so lawfully and must protect them and their extreme vulnerability, and that when they do not, they are accountable under international law. As set out in the evidence, thousands of civilians in and around Tripoli were arrested and detained without lawful reason. Men, women, and children. Libyan nationals, non-Libyans, and black African migrants. Anyone could be arrested by SDF RADA and end up in Mitiga prison under their control, either because they were perceived as political opponents, enemies of the group or its allies, as migrants, or because their views or behavior conflicted with the group's beliefs, or merely because they had something that RADA wanted, be it money, properties, land, or information. Many were never told why they were arrested at all. Madam President, Your Honours, each and every one of the detained persons under the SDF RADA control at Matiga Prison and Compound are victims of the charged crimes. The abuse started upon arrest without proper charges. It worsened during detention. All those detained were subjected to unimaginable conditions of detention, including severe physical and mental suffering. Some cells were so overcrowded that detainees had to sleep on the ground in turns. Witnesses describe that they were so crammed together that they had to lie on their sides, packed so tightly that it felt that they were sleeping in a knife position. Other cells were so small that they contained only one detainee who could barely move, leading to muscle atrophy. Food was scarce, water had to be rationed. Facilities did not allow detainees to maintain basic hygiene. Illnesses festered in these unsanitary conditions. Khalid el-Hishri and other SDF RADA leaders and members weaponized these illnesses, which included tuberculosis, HIV, and various skin diseases, by placing the detainees whom they wanted to punish in cells where they were likely to be infected. Detainees were exposed to continuous, severe physical and psychological suffering. As set out in the evidence, witnesses described hearing, day and night, the screams of those being tortured. They witnessed other detainees being beaten and shot. They tended to dying cellmates who had been denied medical care. Continuous insults, taunting, and humiliation deepened the psychological suffering of the detainees. P. 1673 stated, and I quote, "I felt helpless and devastated. The psychological torment was worse than the physical pain. The humiliation left deep scars on my psyche." End of quote. P. 1026 reflected, and I quote, "I have never seen such horrible things. It is as if they were coming from another planet. They are not humans treating people that way. I think if in the future they were to catch me again, I would rather die than go back there." End of quote. Witness P. 486 likened being detained at Matiga to falling into a well with smooth walls, a well that you cannot get out of. Detainees were repeatedly and severely beaten during their incarceration, including sexualized acts of torture. Some detainees were left in such a bad state that they were transported back to their cell in a wheelbarrow. Others died as a direct result of the torture they endured. The women's section of Matiga Prison was under Khalid el-Hishri's direct control during the period of the charges. Witnesses described the abuses that Khalid el-Hishri and other Matiga perpetrators inflicted on these women. They were shot, whipped, suspended from the ceiling, dragged by their hair, raped, touched, and beaten until they bled. Their own children often witnessed the violence against them. The evidence also shows that minors were themselves beaten, tortured, shot, and raped. P. 943, a woman detained at the prison, described one of her interrogations, and I quote, "The interrogators cursed at me. They ripped my veil off during the interrogations and ordered me by saying, 'Talk, you dog.' In my culture, it is the end of a woman's life if a man takes off her veil against her will. It is very insulting for a man to do this. It showed that they could do anything they wanted with a female prisoner. I felt completely powerless and vulnerable. I felt like everything was over. I became completely depressed by these actions. End of quote. The evidence demonstrates widespread sexual violence against Libyans and non-Libyans alike, men, women, and children. Rape, the threat of rape, forced nudity, and beatings on reproductive organs, to name only a few such abuses, occurred regularly to detainees, irrespective of their age or gender, and sometimes because of it. As set out in our brief and in the evidence, and as you will hear further today, detained victims were enslaved and persecuted on multiple intersecting grounds. The detainees were also each the victim of not just one crime, but multiple crimes committed against them repeatedly throughout their detention. Witnesses recounted that Khalid el-Hishri committed some of these crimes himself. At other times, they were committed by his co-perpetrators and by associates over whom he exercised authority. These were not isolated acts of rogue Matiga prison guards. These crimes were deliberate, widespread, and systematic. The evidence shows that Khalid el-Hishri embodied and induced the behavior that he expected from all SDF RADA members and associates by killing, shooting, torturing, beating, insulting, and sexually assaulting detainees himself. He reprimanded the guards whom he deemed were too lenient. Witness P720 recounted that when a prison leader wanted to take detainees for a bit of exercise and sun, Khalid el-Hishri refused, stating, "What are you doing? You are trying to help them. We are trying to make them die." Witness P1736 was detained in the women's section of Matiga prison and recalls that one day Khalid el-Hishri brought in 2 young male detainees who appeared to have been severely beaten. He ordered the women not to give them any water or food, warning that if they did, the women would take their place and be punished. He told the 2 male detainees, and I quote, "You are not worth killing. You will die here." They did not survive. Witnesses described that this sense of powerlessness endured long after their release. Witness P872 explained, and I quote, "Because of what happened to me, I never feel safe and relaxed. I am always worried that they will come back and arrest me. I lost everything." End of quote. The impact extended far beyond the detainees themselves. Families suffered from years of separation. Witness 1046 stated, and I quote, "Talking about visits from my family makes me feel very emotional. I hardly saw them when I was in prison. My young children grew up when I was detained, and my adolescent boys, who had been adolescents when I was arrested, had beards when I was released." End of quote. Other witnesses recounted that their children no longer recognized them when they were released. Some of those who survived their detention at Matiga prison accepted to become witnesses in these proceedings, often at personal expense. Throughout the investigation, my office heard numerous witnesses recount their ordeal and describe its long-lasting impact. Their lives were shattered by their unlawful imprisonment and abuse at Matiga prison. The abuse inflicted in detention permeated every aspect of the victims' lives, and it continues to haunt them long after their release. For them, the nightmare continues. Many are still suffering from permanent physical disabilities. Others are trying to recover from the psychological trauma resulting from years of detention and sustained abuse. Witness P. 1682 poignantly described the devastating impact of detention at Matiga prison on his life. And let me quote his words. "The arrest and torture were not just a fleeting incident that came and went. They were an earthquake that shattered everything I had believed to be stable in my life. Since that day, I have carried the weight of anxiety in my chest, as if even my own breath no longer belonged to me, as if safety had become a distant, unreachable idea. My relationships crumbled. My image was distorted in the eyes of others, and my career was destroyed without reason, simply because I was a victim at a time that does not recognize victims. The voices of the oppressed, the screams of the tortured, and the darkness of the cold cells still inhabit my mind and soul. I have not truly left the prison. My body left, but my spirit remained imprisoned within it. I carry those memories like a wound that will never heal, searching through this pain for justice, for a sense of fairness, for a light that could dispel the darkness they planted in my depths. The arrest did not only take my freedom temporarily, it stole years from my life and left scars that continue to bleed silently to this day." End of quote. Abuse continues to define the lives of those still detained at Matiga prison. Accountability and the right to truth are mutually reinforcing pillars of international justice. In cases of unlawful detention and abuse, accountability serves not only punitive purposes, but also vindicates the victim's right to know the fate of detainees, the circumstances that enabled the crimes, and the identity of those responsible. The need for accountability in this case is exemplified by the words of witness P. 1736. Khalid el-Hishri tortured and raped her while she was detained at Matiga prison. During her detention, she told him that one day she would face him and seek justice for the wrongs he committed against her. During an interview with my office, she declared, and I quote, "I will be reborn when justice is achieved." End of quote. Madam President, Your Honors, the independent and impartial justice that this court can deliver is a beacon of hope for victims. These crimes must end and must not recur. I would like to express my gratitude to the victims, the witnesses, and the civil society organizations who displayed patience, resilience, and a resolute belief in justice despite the passage of time and the apparent obstacles in bringing this case to court. Madam President, I respectfully submit that this case should be committed to trial. To conclude the prosecution's opening remarks, my colleague, Mr. Hisham Murad, will now address the court in Arabic.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la procureure adjointe de Cannes. Nous passons maintenant aux déclarations liminaires des représentants légaux des victimes. Ah, OK. Ouais. Vous voulez continuer? Voilà, vous avez la parole.
شكرا جزيلا سيدة الرئيس. هيئة المحكمة الموقرة مع بدء جلسات تأكيد التهم اليوم تتعلق آمال الضحايا بقرب تحقيق العدالة التي طال انتظارها. فهذه القضية تشمل 17 اتهاما بارتكاب جرائم حرب وجرائم ضد الإنسانية، مثل القتل والتعذيب والاغتصاب والاعتداءات الجسدية والجنسية والاستعباد والاضطهاد. وقد وقعت هذه الجرائم الجسيمة على مدار أكثر من 6 أعوام، واستهدفت ضحايا معتقلين في سجن معتيقة أو تحت سيطرة جهاز الردع في العاصمة طرابلس وما حولها. وكما سنعرض خلال المرافعة الموضوعية لمكتب المدعي العام في جلسات اليوم والغد، فقد قام خالد الهشري ومعه آخرون مثل عبد الرؤوف كارة وأسامة إنجيم وغيرهم بإرساء نظام مؤسسي ممنهج للتعذيب والاستعباد والاضطهاد وفرض السيطرة وغيرها من الانتهاكات الجسيمة التي لا تنتهك القانون فقط، بل تخالف أبسط القيم الإنسانية الأساسية التي تتعارف عليها جموع البشرية، ولا يبررها دين ولا منطق ولا ضمير. ولعل ما يزيد من جسامة بعض هذه الجرائم إن مرتكبيها قد ادعوا ارتكابها باسم الدين، والدين منهم براء. جرائم أصابت آلاف الضحايا من الرجال والنساء والشيوخ، حتى الأطفال لم يسلموا من بشاعة تلك الجرائم. بعضهم كانوا ضحايا مبشرين للجرائم، وبعضهم أجبروا على مشاهدة تلك الجرائم ترتكب ضد أقرب الناس إليهم، ضد آبائهم وأمهاتهم، وهم لا حول لهم ولا قوة، لتترك تلك الجرائم آثارها عليهم ما بقوا أحياء. تعددت جنسيات الضحايا، ولكن يظل السواد الأعظم من هؤلاء الضحايا من أبناء ذات الشعب الذي ينتمي إليه خالد الهشري ومن شاركه الجرم، أبناء الشعب الليبي الكريم الذي نكن له أسمى معاني التقدير والاحترام. فهو شعب ذو إرث تاريخي عريق يتمتع بسمات العزة والكرامة ودماثة الخلق، وإنه لمن المؤلم أن نرى مثل تلك الجرائم البشعة ترتكب ضد أبنائه الكرام. وفي هذا المقام تحضرني مقولة أحد الشهود في لقائه مع محققي مكتب المدعي العام، واصفاً ما تعرض له من جرم وأثره الذي يأبى الزمن أن يمحوه. فقد قال: لا يمر يوم من حياتي ومن حياة أسرتي إلا ويظهر فيه تأثير اعتقالي والتعذيب الذي تعرضت له خلال احتجازي. الندوب الجسدية التي تركها التعذيب لا تزال ظاهرة على أجزاء من جسدي، تذكرني كل يوم بالألم والخوف والإذلال الذي عانيته. أما الأثر النفسي فعميق. أنا أتذكر الضرب والتعذيب باستمرار، ولا أزال أراهم وهم يضربونني، ولا أزال أشم رائحة المكان الذي احتجزت فيه، وتذورني هذه الذكريات دون سابق إنذار. وثقل تلك اللحظات لم يفارقني أبداً. هيئة المحكمة الموقرة، بعد أن تلوت هذا الجزء القصير من أقوال الشاهد أرجو أن أنتهز هذه الفرصة لأعبر فيها عن تقدير مكتب المدعي العام لهذا الشاهد ولكل الشهود الذين تحملوا أعباء جسيمة وعرضوا أنفسهم وأسرهم لمخاطر جمة من أجل الإدلاء بأقوالهم وإمداد المحكمة بالأدلة المطلوبة، والتي بسببها قد وصلت القضية لتلك المرحلة الهامة من إجراءاتها. أقول باسم مكتب المدعي العام لهؤلاء الشهود ولكل الضحايا إن العدالة هي أقرب اليوم. فاليوم أصواتكم مسموعة أمام هيئة المحكمة الموقرة في سعيها لتحقيق العدالة المنشودة. هيئة المحكمة الموقرة، وبهذه الكلمة المختصرة أنهي المرافعة الافتتاحية لمكتب المدعي العام. مع جزيل الشكر والتقدير.
On vous remercie beaucoup, Monsieur Mourad. Et maintenant, nous pouvons vraiment passer aux déclarations liminaires des représentants légaux des victimes. Et nous avons jusqu'à 11h30. Donc, Maître Pellet, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. On sera peut-être obligé de dépasser un petit peu les 11h30, mais on s'en tiendra en tout cas aux 45 minutes qui nous ont été allouées. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames les juges, nous comparaissons aujourd'hui devant vous au nom des 64 victimes autorisées à participer à la présente procédure depuis le 11 mai dernier. Ces victimes, des civils détenus à la prison de Mitiga, des hommes et des femmes libyens, des migrants africains et d'autres étrangers, qui ont vécu l'enfer carcéral dans lequel le droit n'avait pas lieu d'être et avait été remplacé par la violence, la coercition et la peur. Nous intervenons également au nom de leurs familles respectives, dont la vie a été marquée à jamais par la détention illégale de leurs proches et ou la mort de ces derniers. Ces victimes attendent ce jour depuis plus de 10 ans, et cette audience, loin d'être une simple formalité, constitue une étape cruciale pour comprendre ou tenter de comprendre l'indicible, pour que leur souffrance soit enfin reconnue et que la justice soit rendue en leur nom. Pour la majorité d'entre elles, comprendre est la clé pour tenter de surmonter ces événements tragiques. Il s'agit finalement de donner un sens à l'horreur vécue à travers la reconnaissance judiciaire des schémas d'exaction et des responsabilités individuelles, ainsi que la clarification du contexte. Sans explication, le préjudice persiste, sous une forme différente, affectant le sentiment des victimes de dignité, de sécurité et de clôture. Pour beaucoup, à l'instar de la victime A/00003/26, ce n'est que par la reconnaissance juridique et la vérité judiciaire que les victimes peuvent commencer à accepter ce qu'elles ont enduré et à avancer, tant bien que mal, vers la guérison. Je cite. Je formule cette demande avec la conviction que la Cour pénale internationale est le dernier recours pour les victimes lorsque la justice nationale échoue, et avec la certitude que la justice est imprescriptible et que la dignité humaine mérite protection et reconnaissance. Fin de citation. Le nombre de victimes participant à la présente procédure ne saurait être considéré comme représentatif de l'ampleur de la victimisation dans la présente affaire. elles ne constituent qu'une fraction infinitésimale des victimes touchées par les crimes imputés à M. El Hishri. En effet, un nombre de victimes beaucoup plus important a été soumis au même système d'abus, mais toutes n'ont pas déposé de demande de participation devant cette cour. Certaines résident en Libye ou ailleurs, où les conditions d'insécurité et la peur les empêchent de se manifester. D'autres ne peuvent le faire en raison de traumatismes qu'elles ont endurés ou parce qu'elles n'ont malheureusement pas survécu aux conditions de détention abominables et aux tortures subies à Mitiga entre le 1er mai 2014 et le 30 juin 2020. Leur absence ne remet nullement en cause la réalité des faits, ni ne fragilise le dossier qui vous est soumis. Bien au contraire, Madame la Présidente, Mesdames les juges, elle met en lumière l'ampleur des crimes commis au sein de Mitiga et le grand nombre de voix demeurées inaudibles. Les expériences vécues par les victimes présentent des différences significatives. Elles convergent toutefois autour d'une même réalité essentielle. Mitiga est un lieu où des êtres humains sont privés de leur dignité, exposés à des exactions systématiques et abandonnés au pouvoir absolu de ceux qui le contrôlent, à savoir Rada. 4 groupes distincts de victimes se dégagent. Les ressortissants libyens, les détenus non libyens, les femmes et leurs enfants, ainsi que les familles des détenus. Chacun de ces groupes illustre une facette particulière d'un même système de détention et de violence qui a fasciné la réalité de Mitiga et engage la responsabilité du suspect en tant que l'un de ses principaux auteurs. Pour toutes les victimes, le calvaire commence par leur arrestation. Les circonstances mêmes de ces arrestations révèlent un schéma de persécution. Les victimes ont été appréhendées brusquement à des checkpoints, à leur domicile, sur leur lieu de travail ou dans la rue. Des hommes armés surgissant sans avertissement. Il n'y avait ni procédure judiciaire, ni mandat, ni aucune explication fondée en droit. À la place, Madame la Présidente, Mesdames les juges, des accusations fallacieuses étaient invoquées. En réalité, nombre de victimes ont été prises pour cible en raison de leurs opinions politiques supposées, de leurs affiliations présumées, ou simplement de leur origine géographique, de leur richesse ou de leur nationalité, de leur orientation sexuelle, réelle ou supposée, ou encore afin de faire pression sur leur mari, leur famille ou leurs proches. Elles étaient par la suite qualifiées de traîtres, de terroristes, de partisans de groupes opposés à Rada ou de Daesh, d'apostats, ou affublées de toute autre étiquette fallacieuse destinée à légitimer leur détention. La violence accompagnait systématiquement ces arrestations. Elle s'inscrivait dans un schéma de coercition destiné à imposer d'emblée le contrôle, à briser toute résistance et à instiller la peur avant même l'arrivée des victimes à Mitiga. Et de fait, dans de nombreux cas, les victimes étaient battues lors de leur capture, insultées, humiliées et contraintes avant même leur transfert. Et Madame la Présidente, Mesdames les juges, cette violence initiale n'avait rien d'accessoire. Les victimes étaient ensuite conduites à Mitiga, où elles étaient détenues sans aucun fondement juridique, je l'ai dit, sans procédure judiciaire, et donc sans aucune possibilité réelle de contester leur détention, entièrement abandonnée à la volonté de ceux qui contrôlaient l'établissement, les membres de RADA, parmi lesquels M. Hishri. De nombreuses familles ignoraient même où leurs proches étaient détenus ou s'ils étaient encore en vie, mais nous y reviendrons. Dès leur arrivée à Mitiga, les victimes étaient confrontées à des conditions qui défient l'entendement, marquées par des exactions systémiques, des privations extrêmes et une atmosphère permanente de peur et d'humiliation. Certaines étaient même placées à l'isolement dans des cellules si exiguës que tout mouvement y était presque impossible. Il ne s'agissait pas d'espaces destinés à accueillir des êtres humains. Et pourtant, des personnes y étaient enfermées pendant de longues périodes. D'autres victimes étaient détenues dans des cellules plus grandes, qui n'en constituaient pas moins des lieux de souffrance extrême. Ces espaces étaient surpeuplés, accueillant des dizaines de détenus, parfois plus de 80 hommes, dans une seule cellule. Il n'y avait pas suffisamment de place pour s'allonger. Les détenus étaient contraints de dormir dans ce qu'ils décrivent eux-mêmes comme la position du couteau. Couchés sur le côté, étroitement serrés les uns contre les autres, leurs corps alignés en rangée. Le moindre mouvement exigeait une coordination collective. Lorsqu'un détenu se retournait, tous devaient se retourner simultanément. Même le sommeil était un privilège rare. Certains détenus ne pouvaient se reposer que quelques heures à la fois, tandis que les autres étaient contraints de rester debout durant de longues périodes, faute d'espace suffisant pour permettre à tous de s'allonger en même temps. À l'intérieur de ces cellules, une hiérarchie s'installait. Les détenus présents depuis plus longtemps s'appropriaient les rares espaces disponibles le long des murs. Les nouveaux arrivants étaient relégués au centre de la cellule ou à proximité des prétendues toilettes, utilisées par des dizaines de détenus sans aucune intimité ni conditions sanitaires adéquates. Là encore, l'accès devait être organisé à tour de rôle. Ces conditions sont décrites par la victime A-00023-26 en ces termes, je cite. L'accès aux sanitaires était réglementé par une file d'attente et on ne pouvait y accéder qu'après une quarantaine d'autres détenus, rendant extrêmement difficile la gestion des besoins corporels les plus élémentaires. En conséquence, nous avons développé des conditions telles que la constipation, les hémorroïdes et des infections urinaires, faute de pouvoir nous soulager lorsque nécessaire. Nous étions contraints de dormir debout en nous relayant toutes les 6 heures pour obtenir une place où nous allonger. L'espace attribué à chaque détenu ne dépassait pas une enjambée ou une enjambée et demie, ce qui a provoqué l'apparition de varices en raison des longues périodes passées debout. Fin de citation. La ventilation était inexistante, la lumière minimale, voire totalement absente. L'air était étouffant, la nourriture était insuffisante, tant en quantité qu'en qualité. La faim était constante. L'accès à l'eau était lui aussi sévèrement restreint. Comme l'a déclaré la victime A-00004-26, je cite. Dans la prison, les conditions étaient extrêmement mauvaises. J'ai perdu plus de 45 kilos en raison du manque de nourriture, de la malnutrition et de la promiscuité dans les cellules. Nous étions plus de 42 détenus entassés dans une cellule exiguë. J'ai souffert de la gale ou de démangeaisons constantes pendant toute la durée de mon incarcération. Et malgré mes demandes répétées, je n'ai jamais reçu de traitement ni de médicaments. Fin de citation. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames les juges, pour les victimes, le temps avait cessé d'avoir un sens. Les jours se fondaient dans les nuits et les nuits dans les jours. Certaines d'entre elles ont été détenues pendant des mois, d'autres pendant des années. Aucune ne savait quand, ni même si, elles retrouveraient la liberté ou si leur détention prendrait un jour fin. Mais les conditions de détention ne constituaient qu'un aspect du système mis en place par RADA. La violence à Mitiga était quotidienne. Les détenus étaient régulièrement extraits de leurs cellules pour être soumis à des interrogatoires qui ne visaient pas l'établissement de la vérité, mais plutôt à briser les individus. Comme l'a indiqué Madame la procureure adjointe, les victimes décrivent des coups, des suspensions par des crochets, des électrocutions, des positions de contrainte et des humiliations répétées. Elles entendaient les cris d'autres détenus, ont vu certains revenir blessés ou psychologiquement détruits, ou ont assisté au départ de personnes qui ne sont jamais revenues. Ces méthodes de torture étaient employées de manière routinière dans le cadre d'un schéma d'abus à la fois systématique et délibéré. Au-delà de la violence physique, une cruauté psychologique persistante s'exerçait à Mitiga. Les détenus étaient insultés, dégradés, souvent au travers de propos dirigés contre leur famille. Ils étaient moqués dans leur souffrance, leurs appels à l'aide ignorés, leur humanité constamment niée. Certains détenus sont morts des suites des tortures infligées. D'autres ont succombé aux effets cumulés de la détention, blessures, maladies, négligence. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames les juges. La victime A/00014/26 décrit la situation en ces termes, je cite. La torture consistait parfois à éteindre des cigarettes sur nos corps. Nous étions également suspendus par les mains au-dessus de nous. Le traitement était extrêmement dur. La nourriture était systématiquement restreinte, réduite à un morceau de pain et à 1 litre d'eau par jour. En hiver, nous étions laissés sans vêtements ni chauffage et en été sans climatisation. Des maladies de peau se sont propagées, laissant des marques durables sur mon dos. La tuberculose s'est également répandue, touchant 10 personnes, toutes décédées. Fin de citation. Au-delà de la violence physique infligée quotidiennement et lors des interrogatoires, les victimes décrivent l'omniprésence de la violence sexuelle à Mitiga. Les détenus étaient soumis à des viols et à d'autres formes de violence sexuelle dans le cadre du même système de coercition, de punition et de contrôle. Les victimes décrivent comment ces violences étaient utilisées pour humilier, déshumaniser et anéantir la volonté des personnes détenues. Elles s'accompagnaient de menaces, d'insultes et d'un environnement où toute possibilité de résistance était systématiquement annihilée. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames les juges, pour les femmes détenues, le risque de violence sexuelle était permanent et leur détention s'accompagnait d'une vulnérabilité accrue. Détenues dans une section séparée de la prison, elles étaient à la merci de ceux qui contrôlaient l'accès à leurs cellules. Depuis les sections voisines, les détenus pouvaient entendre leurs cris. Ces cris qui traversaient les murs, contribuant à instaurer un climat de peur et d'impuissance au sein de l'ensemble de la prison de Mitiga. La violence sexuelle n'y était donc ni dissimulée, ni isolée. Elle était connue, elle faisait partie intégrante de l'environnement carcéral. Et comme les autres formes d'exaction, elle s'inscrivait dans un système où le pouvoir s'exerçait sans limite dans une impunité totale. En effet, Madame la Présidente, Mesdames les juges, l'expérience des femmes détenues à Mitiga révèle une dimension supplémentaire de cruauté au sein de ce système d'abus. C'était un lieu où les corps des femmes, leur dignité et leur identité même étaient délibérément pris pour cible. La section des femmes était entièrement sous le contrôle du suspect. Les victimes le décrivent de manière constante comme l'unique autorité sur cette section. Lui seul détenait les clés, lui seul ouvrait les portes et personne n'y entrait sans qu'il en soit informé ou sans son approbation. Rien ne se produisait dans la section des femmes sans le consentement de M. El Hishri. Et ce contrôle absolu plaçait chaque femme détenue dans une dépendance totale à l'égard du suspect. Même les besoins les plus élémentaires, serviettes hygiéniques, soins médicaux, accès à l'air libre, matériel religieux ou simple possibilité de quitter la cellule étaient laissés à son bon vouloir. Les femmes enceintes et les femmes en travail se voyaient refuser des soins médicaux pourtant urgents. Des nourrissons sont morts faute d'assistance médicale. D'autres femmes étaient détenues avec leurs jeunes enfants, témoins des violences infligées à leur mère. Mais c'est la violence infligée au corps et à la dignité des femmes qui a le plus profondément marqué leur expérience. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames les juges. Au-delà de la violence physique, elles ont subi une humiliation délibérément dirigée contre elles en tant que femmes. Pour de nombreuses victimes, cette humiliation était aussi dévastatrice que les coups eux-mêmes. Leurs seins, leurs fesses, leurs parties génitales étaient touchées intentionnellement sous prétexte de fouilles ou de déplacement. D'autres victimes racontent avoir été entièrement dévêtues, tout en étant traitées de putain, d'animal, de chienne ou encore de filles de pute. Leur voile était arraché lors des interrogatoires, un acte d'humiliation profonde et de violence symbolique particulièrement lourd dans le contexte culturel et religieux libyen, comme l'a rappelé Madame la procureure adjointe. Les femmes rapportent que ces expériences les ont laissées avec le sentiment que leur vie était brisée, qu'elles avaient perdu leur honneur, leur statut au sein de leur famille et, dans certains cas, leur avenir. Ceci revêt une importance dans le contexte social libyen, dans lequel la détention d'une femme suffit en elle-même à entraîner une stigmatisation profonde et durable. La simple suspicion de viol peut conduire au rejet familial et à l'effondrement de toute perspective de mariage ou d'intégration sociale. Plusieurs femmes indiquent avoir vécu dans une crainte permanente d'être victimes de violences sexuelles, crainte qui, pour certaines, s'est malheureusement matérialisée. En effet, certaines victimes décrivent des viols, des agressions sexuelles et un harcèlement sexuel répété à l'intérieur de Mitiga. Certaines racontent avoir été agressées directement par M. El Hishri, y compris sous la menace d'une arme à feu. Elles décrivent des nudités forcées, des pénétrations anales, des contacts actes sexuels accompagnés d'insultes dégradantes et de menaces de mort. D'autres femmes de diverses nationalités ont été violées à plusieurs reprises, certaines étant tombées enceintes et ayant été contraintes à subir des avortements. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames les juges, cette atmosphère de peur était constante. À Mitiga, le simple bruit des clés dans le couloir suffisait à déclencher la panique. Ce bruit, aussi anodin soit-il, signifiait pour ces femmes que Khaled el-Hishri approchait. Les victimes ne le décrivent pas seulement comme un garde ou un administrateur. Elles le décrivent comme l'incarnation même de la terreur dans la section des femmes. Un homme dont la voix, les pas et le bruit de ses clés suffisaient à réduire une cellule entière au silence. Pour beaucoup de femmes, le traumatisme ne s'est pas arrêté à leur libération. Les conséquences persistent dans leur corps, dans leur santé mentale, dans leur habilité à concevoir et dans la manière dont elles sont perçues au sein de leur famille et de leur communauté. Certaines femmes rapportent une infertilité durable, des douleurs chroniques, des attaques de panique, une honte persistante liée à la stigmatisation attachée à la détention et à la violence sexuelle. Pour elles, Mitiga ne s'est pas arrêtée aux portes de la prison. Mitiga continue chaque jour. Mais Madame la Présidente, Mesdames les juges, à ce stade, il est essentiel de souligner que le suspect n'était pas un commandant distant. Il était présent, il était visible, il était connu et parfaitement identifié par les victimes. Il était décrit comme l'un des tortionnaires les plus redoutés de la prison dans son entier. Un homme qui exerçait un pouvoir sur la vie et sur la mort de l'ensemble des détenus à Mitiga, et non seulement des femmes. Madame la Présidente, je vous serais reconnaissante de donner la parole à Maître Massida pour la suite des déclarations d'ouverture. Et je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Maître Pellet. Maître Massida, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Mon intervention prendra environ 20 minutes, donc je demande votre indulgence pour compléter dans cette session. Je vous remercie d'avance.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Massida. Vous avez les minutes qu'il vous faut.
Madam President, Your Honors, alongside Libya's detainees, migrants were also held within Mitiga. The accounts of the victims demonstrate that the suffering of migrants is not accidental. It is the result of structures of abuse, militia control, and international complicity that allowed Mitiga and other detention facilities in Libya to operate with impunity for years. Many migrants had already endured violent interception at sea by the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, only to be returned to Libya against their will and immediately detained. They believed they had already survived the worst. They had not. The experience of migrant victims cannot be understood as mere detention. It was a system of enslavement, a system in which those in control exercised power akin to ownership. In the words of A/00043/26, I quote, "I didn't just feel like a slave. They called us slaves. That's all they called us. They didn't use our names, just referred to us as slaves. It was used to insult and humiliate us as much as possible." End of quote. Migrants were placed at the very bottom of the hierarchy at Mitiga. They were treated as disposable. A/00033/26 26 explains, I quote, "They limited our sleep because they needed us to work. They referred to us as slaves. If you told them your name, it didn't matter. They just say, 'Hey, you, slave,' and gave us orders," end of quote. Like other detainees, migrants were held in overcrowded, unsanitary, and degrading conditions, deprived of food and basic needs. But their treatment often went further. They were subject to stricter control, harsher punishment, and constant surveillance. Violence and threat enforced their detention. Escape was impossible. Resistance brought immediate and severe consequences. What most clearly distinguished the experience of migrants' victims is the systematic exploitation of their labor. Migrants were forced to work, never voluntarily, always under coercion and fear. They were compelled to perform exhausting, degrading tasks. As A/00030/26 recalls, I quote, "Feeling like a slave every day, being beaten and being forced against my will to do hard labor was degrading, and I felt helpless," end of quote. They cleaned cells and facilities in unsanitary conditions, transported heavy goods, carried out construction work, and performed duties that placed them in direct proximity to the violence perpetrated at Mitiga. A/00043/26 describe the relentless nature of this exploitation in these words, I quote, "They made us work continuously. We worked from around 6 a.m. until the early evening, like around 6 p.m. Then we'd rest for 1 or 2 hours. And then they come and made us work again until the early hours of the morning. Then we'd rest again for 1 or 2 hours. They only gave us these short breaks to keep us alive, so they could keep us working more," end of quote. Migrants were also compelled to assist in the abuse of our detainees. Forced to facilitate strip searches, to restrain detainees during interrogation, or to escort them to torture site. Some were made to supervise, guard, or discipline other detainees, placed in position of authority under coercion, transforming victims into instruments of the system. Your Honor, this was not incidental. It was integral to how the system functioned, using one group of victims to control and harm another. Migrants, like other detainees, were subjected to forms of control that were deeply sexualized, gendered, and degrading. They were forced to undergo invasive body searches. They were stripped, exposed, humiliated. They were subject to sexual violence, sexualized torture, and threat of rape, including violence targeting intimate parts of the body, their reproductive autonomy, and pregnant women. Sexual violence was not separate from the system of enslavement, it was part of it. It reinforced domination, submission, and the complete denial of autonomy, protection, and rights. Psychological control was equally pervasive. Migrants faced constant threat against themselves and their families. They were insulted, dehumanized, and reduced to derogatory stereotypes. Fear shaped every aspect of daily life, reinforced by violence, humiliation, and the suffering they witnessed around them. The system also operated through coercion disguised as choice. Some migrants were offered appearance privileges, slightly better conditions, reduced violence, minor advantages in exchange for compliance. But these were not real choices. They existed within a context where refusal meant punishment and survival depended on submission. What emerged from the account of migrant victims is not a collection of isolated acts, it is a system. A system in which migrants were targeted because of who they were, because of their nationality, their skin color, their perceived status. A system in which they were assigned the most dangerous, degrading, and violent roles. A system in which their vulnerabilities was exploited at every level. For these victims, Mitiga was not only a place of suffering. It was a place where their labor was exploited, their bodies controlled, and their dignity denied, where they were made to exist for the benefit, the power, and the violence of others. Madam President, Your Honors, the suffering caused by what happened in Mitiga did not end at the prison gates. It extended into families, into homes, and into the daily lives of those who were left behind. Families of detainees lived in a state of constant uncertainty. When their relatives were arrested, they were not told where they had been taken. For days, weeks, sometimes months, families searched desperately for answers about the fate of their loved ones. A/00027/26 described this ordeal with these words, I quote, "After their kidnapping by the Rada militiamen, we did not know where they were, and we looked for them everywhere for a long time until we finally learned they were in Mitiga. Not knowing where they were was unbearable," end of quote. Even when detainees were eventually located, contact remained severely restricted. Visits, when permitted at all, were often conducted by video, delayed without explanation, or suspended entirely for long periods. During these silences, families lived with one single overwhelming fear, that their loved one had died. A/00019/26 explains, I quote, "We were consumed by fear, believing he had died in detention. Even when contact was allowed, it was not in person. It was conducted via camera and a screen. He appeared in a terrible condition, severely emaciated in a frightening way," end of quote. This uncertainty became a form of suffering in itself. Children grow up not knowing whether their fathers were alive. Mothers waited without answers. Families lived suspended between hope and despair. The economic consequences were devastating. In many households, the detained person was the primary provider. Their sudden disappearance plunged families into financial hardship. Families were forced to sell property, businesses, and personal belongings simply to survive. Children were forced to stop attending school because their families could no longer afford the costs of education. As a result, opportunities were lost, futures were permanently altered. The social consequences were equally severe. A/00050/26 recounts, I quote, "We were unable to find him or to know his whereabouts for a long time, which was extremely difficult for the entire family. I was very worried about him because I could not visit him and I had no news about him, which caused so much stress. They took our money, our happiness. Why? Why would they bring us such injustice? They left us with nothing except for constant pain and fear. End of quote. Children of detainees like A/0003726 were bullied and stigmatized. Families faced pressure, intimidation, and a pervasive sense of insecurity. They felt watched, vulnerable, and exposed. Some families learned, often indirectly, that a loved one had died in detention. They were denied the opportunity to say goodbye, denied even the dignity of seeing them one last time. And even when detainees were eventually released, the suffering did not end. They returned weakened, often seriously ill or with permanent disabilities, bearing the visible and invisible scars of months, often of years of detention, torture, and neglect. Their families then carried a new burden: the cost of medical treatment, weight of trauma, and the realization that life could not seem to return to what it had been. A/00009/26 describes, I quote, "In the first period after my release, I was overwhelmed by fear and unable to return to my normal life. I stayed at home and did not dare to go out alone. I was always accompanied by my mother because I was afraid of being abducted again." End of quote. For many families, the damage is lasting. A/00053/26 was excluded from her family because of her husband's detention. She explains, I quote, "I lost my life, I lost my job, I lost my friends, my family, and I am in constant fear because of what happened to my husband. I also lost the possibility of being a mother because he became completely infertile as a result of events he underwent in Mitiga." End of quote. These families continue to live with fear, particularly in a context where some responsible for the detention remain present and influential. They continue to experience anxiety, insecurity, and the lingering effects of years of uncertainty, hardship, and stigmatizations. These families are also victims. They suffer not only because of what was done to their loved ones, but because of what that loss, that absence, and that uncertainty did to their lives. These victims seek recognition of that suffering, recognition that the crimes committed in Mitiga extended beyond the walls of a prison, and they too seek justice. Madam President, Your Honors, the harm suffered by all victims is profound and enduring. Many continue to live with physical injuries, damaged limbs, chronic pain, untreated wounds, permanent disabilities. Others carry psychological trauma, nightmares, anxiety, and the fear that persists long after their release. Their lives have been fundamentally altered. Families have been broken, livelihoods lost, futures disrupted. For victims, the experience of Mitiga did not end with their release. It continues every day in memory, in fear, and in the struggle to rebuild their lives. And yet, despite all that I've endured, they have chosen to come before this court. all the victims participate in these proceedings because they want the truth to be known, because they want what happened inside Mitiga to be recognized for what it was, a system of crimes. They seek accountability for those who ordered, enabled, and carried out these acts. They seek acknowledgement that their suffering mattered, and they seek justice, not only for themselves, but for those who did not survive, for those whose voices can no longer be heard, and those who still wait for freedom. Madam President, Your Honors, today's hearing marks a historic moment. 1 year ago, victims felt utterly abandoned, forced to watch Mr. Osama Niem evade surrender to the court and then be repatriated, a sequence of events that struck them as a profound betrayal of their pursuit of justice. Today, they see a long closed door cracking open again, and with it, the first real sign that justice may finally begin to move towards them rather than away. This case marks a moment of profound consequence, not only for the suspect, not only for the victims, but for the enduring principle that law must triumph over violence and that human dignity must prevail over fear. For years, the walls of Mitiga concealed suffering. They concealed torture, humiliation, exploitation, and the destruction of human lives. But today, in this courtroom, those walls no longer shield the truth. The victims have brought the truth before you. They have carried it with courage, with dignity, and with a determination that no system of abuse could silence or destroy. This case matters because it affirms that even where the rule of law has collapsed, the reach of justice does not end. It matters because it tells every victim, Libyan, non-Libyan, migrant, man, woman, child, that their suffering is not invisible and their pain is not forgotten. It matters because it affirms that what was done to them was not fate, not misfortune, and not an inevitable consequence of conflict, but crime. And it matters because it sends a message far beyond this courtroom, that those who wield power to destroy lives will one day be called to account, that those who believe themselves beyond the reach of justice will one day stand where the suspect stands now, and that the voices of victims, silenced in cells and drowned out by violence, will ultimately be heard loud and clear in a court of law. Madam President, Your Honors, this is why victims are here, enduring the pain of remembrance, not for vengeance, but for recognition, for accountability, for justice. And today, they place their trust in this court and the promise that justice will be done. Your Honors, this concludes our submission in opening statement for the victims that we represent. We thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Maître Masida. Comme j'ai indiqué précédemment, nous devons suspendre maintenant et nous reprendrons à 13h30. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.